Charting Toward Intimacy covers mature topics. Listener discretion is advised. Charting Toward Intimacy covers mature topics. Listener discretion is advised. Hey there, welcome to Charting Toward Intimacy, where we're expanding the natural family planning conversation. I'm your host, Ellen Holloway. All right, we are here with Mary Finnigan, and this is the last episode in our very large series on the seasons of NFP use. And this episode, actually, Mary, I'm not sure if you know this, but this episode is what started this whole series that I've been doing. I had requests from listeners to do an episode on perimenopause. So I am so excited to welcome Mary to the podcast and discuss the season of perimenopause. So Mary, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for hosting the podcast, and thanks for including this topic.
Awesome. So before we get started, Mary, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am living in Arizona. So I am semi-retired. My husband is retired. So we retired here from Massachusetts about 3 years ago. I'm 63. I say semi-retired because I still teach NFP and I still do supervision of teachers who are in training. So I don't consider myself fully retired. I've been teaching NFP and training since 1990. So that's about 32 years. So hopefully I won't have been doing that longer than some of your listeners, I'm sure. But if some of your listeners are listening because they're perimenopausal, then that won't be the case. They will have been born when I started teaching NFP 32 years ago. I retired from being the coordinator of NFP services in the Archdiocese of Boston. So I was there for almost 19 years doing that work before we moved here to Arizona. My experiences with the Boston cross-check method.
Okay, so perimenopause, the season that we are discussing today, perimenopause is defined by different methods in different ways. We're not going to specifically say, perimenopause starts at this age, because different methods will define it in different ways. Some methods have an age, some methods have certain things that they're looking for in your chart. Some methods kind of use a combo of the two, different ages. But essentially, perimenopause is the period of time when your body is ending its relative fertility. And so it's sometimes defined as the last 60 cycles. Now, you wouldn't necessarily know, okay, I'm on my 55th cycle of my last 60 cycles. You won't know until you're done. But essentially, perimenopause is when your body is kind of shutting down its fertility cycles and its systems through there. So, Mary, can you tell us a little bit about your personal experience charting during the season of perimenopause?
So first of all, my experience was over 20 years ago. So it's going to be, I think, very different in some ways today because of the hormonal testing tools that we have available. So when I think back to my experience and the experience of the women that I'm working with, because we use hormonal tests in our system, I think it's a lot clearer and a lot easier. I think hormonal testing we've seen has played a really crucial role with women who are postpartum breastfeeding, because they have some of the same issues as women who are entering perimenopause with cycle irregularity. So I think during times of transition, like postpartum breastfeeding, during perimenopause, when cycles become irregular or a little bit unpredictable, I think that's really where hormonal tests shine. So
sure.
In fact, we find when we did a look back, about 85% of our clients every year are postpartum breastfeeding clients, which tells us that the tools are really helpful. And the same with perimenopause. So I think, again, I can talk about my experience, but with the clients I work with today, their experience is different than what I had 20 years ago. But anyway, so I wanted to kind of clarify that, because we know a whole lot more in general about perimenopause now than we did 20 odd years ago.
Sure.
And we have more tools available in NFP circles. So in Boston Crosscheck, we define the transition of perimenopause into three distinct parts. Those late reproductive years, they're kind of broad categories. So those late reproductive years, and again, that's going to be different. That's not method specific. That's woman specific. Mm-hmm. So that could be anywhere from 38 to 45. So that late reproductive stage where things just are changing subtly, So women who are charting are going to notice those subtle changes, right? Like some bleeding changes, shorter cycles, longer bleeding, heavier bleeding. So just some subtle changes begin to happen in that time frame somewhere there. And my experience and the experience of women I work with is it's not terribly challenging because they're still having ovulatory cycles for sure. And they're even getting regular ovulatory cycles for sure. They're just occasionally getting something that's perhaps usually shorter is how it's going to start. So usually shorter cycles. And so it just calls for some really minor adjustments, right? They're still ovulating. They can still find the end of fertility. They're getting some shorter cycles or an occasional shorter cycle in those years. And so there's an earlier start to fertility. So generally the challenges, I think the big challenge is just knowing kind of what to expect at that particular point and knowing what could happen and how to make the necessary adjustment. So I think the challenges there are really manageable, and they don't seem to be unduly stressful once people get some basic information and kind of know what's going on and, okay, how do I adjust now? So that's kind of those late reproductive years. And then early perimenopause is definable. So there has been a staging of reproductive aging that we've had now for well over a decade. That's used in medical circles. And so we make use of it because we can stage it. And in early perimenopause, that's when they're really starting to get much more cycle variation. And of course, every person enters that at a different time and stays in that kind of stage there for a different amount of time. But it is defined. So I do want to define it because this is how the medical community is going to define it. And this is how kind of people, I think, need to think about it. So early perimenopause, cycle variation is really the key to aging. So staging, it has nothing to do with ages. It actually has to do with cycle variability. And almost every NFP method is going to use this as well. So once a woman starts to have a difference of more than 7 days between consecutive cycles, that's really early perimenopause. So again, I'll repeat that. A difference of 7 or more days in the length of consecutive cycles, and it has to happen twice in 10 cycles. So that's how the medical community over 10 years ago staged early perimenopause. So women can start to have some variation, but it might not be consecutive in those later years, right? They've got some variation and then they got 5 normal cycles and then they get a zinger short cycle. So you're looking at consecutive cycles and you're looking at that it's repeating itself. It's not just once a year. So once that kind of happens and a woman looks back over the past 10 months or 10 cycles and say, gee, I've had that variation twice now, and it's been consecutive cycles. So in other words, I've gone from 25 to 40 days. And then 5 months later, it was 25 to 40 days. Then we know they're officially early perimenopause. And as I said, that's how the medical community stages it. That's how most NFP methods now are staging early perimenopause. And again, it's a different age for each woman, and they're going to be in that stage. I think this is the time when challenges get real. And I think it was for myself as well, because it's not just an occasional now. It might not be once a year or once every 7 months. I get a cycle that's shorter or longer. It's becoming more frequent. They're still ovulating, and they're still absolutely ovulating and bleeding so they can find the end of fertility with no issue. It's because they don't know at the start of the cycle, right? Is it going to be short or long?
Right.
Am I going to have an early ovulation or a late ovulation? They don't know it. Or is it just going to be my ordinary thing? And so they don't know what's coming when they start a new cycle or a new chart. And so oftentimes what happens is people end up applying whatever method they're using, conservative rules and guidelines, to that cycle when it might not be necessary, because it might be an ordinary cycle.
Yeah.
Or it might be a longer cycle. And so I think people get a little bit frustrated because when the cycle is said and done, they look back and they say, I was way too conservative, but I didn't know that on day 4 of the cycle, for example. And so they might have had extra abstinence if they're postponing pregnancy in that cycle that was unnecessary, but they didn't know it at the front end. And so they can end up with larger windows of potential fertility and end up being more conservative than they need to. But there's really no other way to proceed, honestly, because we don't know how that cycle is going to unfold.
Right.
And so I think this is the most challenging time for women who are aging, because of course they've got the cycle of variability happening, the kind of the unknown happening. And usually this is a time when couples aren't seeking pregnancy, right? At 44, 47, 46. And so the two big challenges, which I know is your fourth question, is the cycle variability with the concern over an unattended pregnancy in their 40s or mid 40s or late 40s. Unlikely as it is, the concern is real. So those are the two challenges, and they get really heightened at that midpoint there, where they're still ovulating, still bleeding, but saying, geez, is this going to be 20 days or is this going to be 40 days? Mm-hmm. So that's the big challenge. And that was the challenge in my own life. Again, hormonal testing can be helpful there. And then, of course, they come into, as you alluded to a few moments ago, to that late part of perimenopause. And that's defined as at least once having 60 days without ovulation and bleeding. So that's how that's defined. So they have at least one cycle that was 60 days in length. And technically, the medical community won't consider them late perimenopause until they've gone at least one cycle that's 60 days or longer in length. Because this is the part where they start to have more frequent long cycles, not short cycles. So they go from having those ordinary cycles to shorter cycles, 20 days, 21 days, to some longer ones, maybe 35 in there. And then all of a sudden they get the zinger. They get that first one that's 60 days or longer. And that technically is where the count starts. So that's really where we know that they're in late perimenopause. And again, that could be anywhere from 1 to 3 years on average, kind of stuck there. Now, oftentimes I find that women get really concerned here because they think it's going to be the most challenging time. But as it kind of unfolds at this very kind of end stage here, where they're going maybe many months with no ovulation and no bleeding, they might have 4 bleeds a year, for example, or 5. The patterns get really quiet, with fertility. So they might go weeks with no cervical fluid, for example, or weeks on a monitor with low. So it actually becomes a little less challenging because it almost seems a little bit more predictable, right? I know I'm going to have many, many weeks of lows on hormonal tests, or I'm going to have many, many weeks if they're using cervical fluid of dryness and absence there. So there aren't a lot of signs of fertility, which is somewhat comforting, I think, for women who are postponing pregnancy. And I know you and I had chatted about this earlier. I always tell them it's really the reverse of if they've had postpartum breastfeeding experiences, it's the reverse of that. Mm-hmm. Postpartum breastfeeding, they have long periods without ovulation and bleeding. And then they go into cycles, but they're irregular cycles usually. And then they finally normalize into regular cycles. This is just the reverse. They started out with regular cycles, and then they go into this irregular kind of pattern. And then they have that long pattern of, anovulation and no bleeding. And the protocols are near identical for almost every method at that point, because, they're in that pattern of, long kind of weeks at an end with no signs of fertility. So it really is the reverse of that experience. And if they've had that experience and they've navigated that experience, it kind of builds their confidence that I did this before. I had this kind of experience before, I can do it again. And of course, their fertility is winding down, which is very different when they were postpartum breastfeeding at 24 or 28 or 34, right? The odds just by age alone are reducing the chances not only of conceiving, but of actually holding a pregnancy and having a live birth. So their age is working in their favor if they're postponing pregnancy at this point that wasn't working in their favor earlier on. So I find that women, in my own experience, feel a lot more confident, I think, at this point in those final years than kind of that midpoint where I just started really into perimenopause. So I'll stop there because I think that's probably questions 3 and question 4.
I know I was going to say, our next question is, what are some of the most difficult aspects of charting during the season? I think you mentioned a lot of them. Were there any other kind of difficult aspects you wanted to talk about?
Well, the top 2, as I said, I think are that cycle variability, which is a challenge the minute they start, and then that concern over unattended pregnancy. I think those are the 2 biggest challenges. And of course, it's going to be different for different couples, which one of those would be number 1 and which one would be number 2. But I think those really are the top 2 I find challenges when I work with women, let's say, who are between the ages of 40 and 50, roughly. as they navigate through these particular times. And maybe the final thing I might mention that I know is frustrating for women is we define menopause in a way that it really doesn't sync well with charting, because menopause is 12 calendar months with no bleeding and usually no spotting, right? And so that's kind of the definition. But women are going to bleed a lot longer than they're going to ovulate generally. That's the trend. So the first thing that goes is ovulation, not bleeding and spotting. So they could go many months without ovulating, but then they get a bleed, some sort of hormonal event. And again, the medical community is still using, if you've had any bleeding and spotting, fertility is still present, you want menopausal or whatever. And that last year, they may not have any ovulations, but they still had some bleeding and spotting. Mm-hmm. So I've had a number of clients who get pretty frustrated by that, because they're like, wait a minute, I've been observing fertility signs and I haven't ovulated in 11 months. And now I've got a bleed. Now, what are the odds that I'm going to ovulate again?
Yeah.
You know? So that can be frustrating for women, I think. And also, we don't have really great tools. And I think the definition tells you we don't have great tools.
Yeah.
Like, how can that be the definition? You have 11 months with no bleeding and spotting, because hormonal testing is kind of random. Women can have great results on a hormonal test. They might get, and then 5 months later have an abnormal kind of. So at some point, hormonal testing is helpful, but not in those early stages. And you have to be pretty close to the end. And I have found that many women, even with hormonal tests that might verify, listen, it's really unlikely that you're ever going to ovulate again. Again, we hold to that, but have you had any bleeding and spotting in the past 12 months? So I find that was a frustration for me when I took my NFP charts in and I said, look at this, I'm not ovulating, yada, yada. Well, where is the bleeding? And it still happens today, 20 years later, that I still have clients who have been told, no, you need to continue to chart until you've gone 12 calendar months with no bleeding and spotting. I mean, I've had clients go 300 days and then get a spot or a bleed. And then, you got to start your count again. And we're like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Can't be done. So I think those are the challenges. Cycle variability, the very real concern about pregnancy in your 40s, which is real for couples for sure and for women. And then the lack of a really good way to help women know, how close am I to the end, for example, or am I ever going to ovulate again? Or could I really conceive again? Those questions are still really difficult for the medical community to answer. And again, that just heightens all the challenges for women in general, and certainly with charting in particular.
Yes, definitely. Oh my gosh. I can't even imagine. I'm a far ways off from that.
Well, hopefully in another 10, 15, 20 years, we'll have better ways of working with this issue.
Yes. I mean, that I really, really hope that the medical community continues to, work on these aspects because it's not enough. I mean, and I think we say this a lot. Those of us who are kind of in this fertility awareness space and NFP space of like, it's not enough right now what we know. And we know that there is more that we should know about how our fertility cycles work and how our bodies work. And, if we can continue to advocate for that, then we can have better results and we can have better diagnostic tools for seasons like perimenopause that can be so irregular and difficult. So what are some tips or suggestions that you have for women and couples who are navigating this season of perimenopause and using NFP in this season?
One I'm sure you've talked about has come up with all of your previous seasons, which is to work closely with an instructor.
Yep.
So it doesn't matter whether you have really, quote, regular cycles or you're 47. I mean, this is like the mantra, right, of NFP instructors. And people find an instructor, please. Don't go on to Facebook. Don't go on to, whatever, and post your question on wherever you're posting it or whatever. Find an instructor. Absolutely. Find an instructor and work with an instructor, and to form, a partnership and a relationship maybe early on in this whole thing, so that as things are changing and evolving, you're working with someone who knows you, who knows your cycle history. I think that's the tip that probably every single person has said for every single season. You need to find a method that works for you and a method you're comfortable working with. And then you need to have the right fit between you and the method, and you need to have an instructor. So that's the number one thing I would say. Find a method and find an instructor.
I would even go one step further than that, right? You need to find a method that's a good fit. You also need to find an instructor that's a good fit. If you are not like vibing with your instructor, it's okay to go find a new instructor. If the method's a good fit, but the instructor's not a great fit, that's okay. You can go and find a new instructor. And I would highly encourage that, especially for these more difficult seasons like perimenopause and postpartum. It's really important to be able to, easily speak with your instructor. And if you're having a hard time communicating with them, for whatever reason that might be, you just might not be on the same page, or your communication preferences might be different, whatever that is, it doesn't really matter. You need to find an instructor that's going to work well for your situation.
So that's number one. And I think the other is to trust your experience. I think if someone is in their 40s and, interested in this topic and having questions about the topic, my sense is most of them are not brand new at 42 to NFP. Now that happens, that there are people who find out about charting fertility signs, in their later years. But most of the time, they're people who have been doing this, and some for maybe 5, 10, 15. Some of them have been doing it their whole reproductive life, or came to this in their late 20s or 30s or whatever, and have a knowledge base and have experience on which to draw. And if that's the case, then they absolutely have to draw on that and trust that, right? Mm-hmm. Just because the cycles are changing doesn't mean using the tools changes. Well, it does somewhat with hormonal testing, but in general, if you've been a person who's tracked cervical fluid, observing and tracking that, you've got a lot of experience there, or using temperature patterns or whatever. You've got a lot of experience there, and to trust that experience, even though you might be tweaking a tool or tweaking a protocol or tweaking a rule, the basics about anatomy and hormones and cycles, none of that changes.
Right.
So, your knowledge base will stand you in good stead. And so to trust that you can draw on that, and to draw on it and not be afraid to draw on it. And so I think that's the second tip I would give is be trusting and to draw on the knowledge you have and the experience you have of observing signs, charting signs, and integrating this into your life as a woman and into your life as a couple, that you can draw on that and count on it. So those were the two things I was going to highlight there.
Yeah, I love that. That's fantastic. Well, Mary, is there anything else that you wanted to share before we close out the episode?
To not fear, I guess, to not fear this time, that it's possible to live with your fertility through your 40s and to the end. And as in all the seasons of your reproductive life, you may feel at sometimes isolated or perhaps alone, or maybe not understood by a person in the medical community. And that's really not going to change perhaps for you when you're in your 40s, but that it's possible and it's doable. And I think I think probably every NFP instructor has had this experience where they come across someone who maybe for 5, 10, 15, 20 years has been doing just fine here. And then all of a sudden just abandons the ship. Mm-hmm. They just start to panic or get overly anxious or concerned, and they just give up and they say, I just can't do this. It's not possible for me to be able to do this to the bitter end. And they just abandon the whole way of living with their fertility. And I find that unfortunate. And it's probably for lots of reasons that it happens, but that it doesn't have to be. They don't have to make that choice. Mm-hmm. Certainly some women will, but they don't have to make that choice. There should be a way with, as you said, the proper fit with instructor and method, and with the trust that they have in their own knowledge base, that they can navigate it to the bitter end. I mean, I think I gave you the example when we spoke earlier. I had a particular client who kind of said, I'm just not going to chart anymore and just not observe. And that's a decision that some couples and women do make. They get to a certain point and they know it's highly unlikely. And they're like, nope, I'm all done. Even if I might have a bleeding 6 months from now, I'm just going to, accept the fact that it's, a very small chance I'm done. And then other women will chart, to the very bitter end until they've had 12 consecutive months of no spotting or bleeding. And some women, go back and forth. So it's not unusual to have a client say, well, I think I'm done, and then just stop. And then a few months later say, no, I think I better go back to that charting. So every woman is a little bit different, and there's no correct answer, right? Every woman will make a decision. Some, as I said, will go to the bitter end and say, yep, I've got all of that documented. And then at another point, there might be a couple or a woman who says, you know what, we're just going to stop now and call it done. And we're comfortable with that. And we're going to live with that. So I think probably that's the final thing to say is there's no right or wrong to go to the bitter end, or maybe in that final year to just say, you know what, I think it's highly unlikely now. And we're comfortable now with not observing signs and not charting signs, and just kind of saying it's finished there. One is not better than the other, a better approach. I've had clients do both, and it really is a personal kind of a matter. But the point is, either of those decisions can be a good one. And it doesn't mean that they've just kind of given up and kind of abandoned it all. They've made a decision based on what they're comfortable with and what their cycles are telling them, to just say, no, this is it. We're done.
Yeah. Oh, I so appreciate that you added that at the end, because I think a lot of times in NFP, we, and on this podcast too, but I think this happens a lot with instructors, that we know the rules so well. And we're like, this is what you have to do for all of the rules. And it's important as couples who are using NFP to understand, okay, yes, these are the rules. This is what your instructor is going to tell you to do for best practices, but you need to do what works for you and your spouse and your situation. And, there's no right or wrong way to do it.
No, as I said, there isn't. And I've had clients choose both routes, and they're both appropriate in the situations that they're in. So, and that gives people, I think, a little bit of freedom, for a woman to know, well, I could make the choice that I'm going to track every single thing, every possible way or whatever, continue with what I've been doing until I can really show my physician that I've had 12 consecutive calendar months with no bleeding and spotting. That's a perfectly viable way to approach it. Or someone else might say, you know what, I've looked at all of this, and a reasonable person could make the decision to say, this is pretty much over. So, and for some couples, that's really freeing to do that. Just as for other couples, it's really kind of a freeing thing to say, nope, I can do this right to the bitter end. And that's okay too.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Well, Mary, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your experience and your expertise. I so appreciate it. And I know that many of you guys listening are so excited to have, heard all of this and be able to take this information with you on your way. Thank you so much, Mary.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening. I do want to remind you that this episode is one of 9 of a huge series that we did on NFP use throughout the different seasons of life. So definitely go check out the episodes before this episode. This is the last episode in that series. And check out those episodes if you are in that season, or you know someone in that season, or you're soon to be in that season. There is really great info and tips and tricks for all of those different seasons of life. If you are not already following us on Instagram, be sure to check us out at Charting Toward Intimacy. And if you have questions, comments, episode topic ideas, please reach out to me. My email is in the show notes. I love to hear from you guys. Until next time.